In the early 1940s, the battlefields of the Pacific were defined by a phenomenon that baffled Western commanders and terrified their soldiers: a complete and total refusal to surrender. To the Imperial Japanese soldier, the act of laying down one's arms was not merely a military failure, it was a spiritual extinction. This was the era of the cult of non-surrender, a period where the surrender rate hovered at a staggering 1% or less. Thousands of men chose to vanish into the earth rather than spend a single hour in a prisoner of war camp. The foundation of this fanatical resolve was not accidental. It was a carefully constructed ideology rooted in the Senjinkun, or the Field Service Code, issued by War Minister Tojo Hideki in 1941. One sentence within this manual dictated the fate of millions: do not survive to suffer the disgrace of capture. To the Japanese infantryman, surrender meant the forfeiture of his humanity. He would be erased from his family registry. His soul would never rest at the Yasukuni shrine, and he would be dead to his parents and his emperor. In their minds, a prisoner was no longer a man. He was a ghost. This was vividly demonstrated during the Battle of Tarawa in 1943. Nearly 5,000 elite Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces occupied the tiny island. When the smoke cleared after several days of some of the bloodiest fighting in history, the Americans found only 17 Japanese soldiers alive. The rest had fought until their last bullet, and when the ammunition ran out, they turned their bayonets on themselves or launched suicidal Banzai charges into the face of machine gun fire. This 1% survival rate became the terrifying standard of the Pacific War. To the Americans, this looked like madness. To the Japanese, it was the ultimate expression of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. The soldier was taught that his life was as light as a feather compared to the heavy duty he owed the emperor. This cult of death created a battlefield where no quarter was given and none was expected. It led to the suicide cliffs of Saipan, where not only soldiers but also civilians threw themselves into the sea to avoid the perceived shame of American occupation. Yet this absolute rejection of surrender was also a heavy burden for the individual soldier. Behind the fanatical exterior were men who missed their homes and feared the darkness. But the social pressure and the brutal discipline of the Imperial Army, where officers frequently beat subordinates to harden their spirit, ensured that the line held. The cult of non-surrender turned the Pacific into a graveyard of honor, where the only way out was through the barrel of a gun or the blade of a knife. In this first chapter of our deep dive, we recognize that the 1% surrender rate was not a sign of military strength, but a psychological prison. The Japanese soldier was trapped between a relentless enemy in front of him and a culture of shame behind him. Breaking this cycle would eventually require more than just bombs and bullets. It would require the slow, agonizing realization that the empire they were dying for had already abandoned them. The cult of non-surrender was the peak of Japan's martial pride, but it was also the beginning of its ultimate tragedy.
In the humid jungles of the Solomon Islands and the frozen marshes of the Aleutians, a silent, invisible enemy began to eat away at the foundation of the Japanese military spirit. For the first 2 years of the war, the Japanese soldier believed he was part of a divine, invincible machine. This belief was anchored by the Mitsubishi Zero, a plane that seemed to dominate the sky through supernatural agility. But in mid-1942, a single event occurred that would begin the psychological crack in the armor of the Imperial Japanese Army: the loss of the Akutan Zero. When Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga crashed his Zero on a remote Alaskan island, he didn't just lose a plane, he handed the Americans the keys to the Japanese soul. For the first time, Allied engineers dissected the invincible ghost of the Pacific. They found that the Zero was built with a terrifying disregard for the pilot's life. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. This discovery mirrored a growing realization among the infantry on the ground. The empire, they began to see, valued the machine and the mission far more than the man. As 1943 progressed, the psychological crack deepened through the edge of exhaustion. On islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, the High Command's promise of spiritual victory began to fail against the brutal reality of logistics. The Japanese soldier, once proud and disciplined, was now starving. They were the walking dead, surviving on grass, roots, and the bark of trees. While the American industrial monster showered the islands with endless supplies, hot meals, and fresh reinforcements, the Japanese soldier was left to rot in the mud. This was the moment the legend of invincibility shattered. The soldiers began to notice a disturbing trend. Their officers were often the only ones with full bellies, while the rank and file were ordered to commit gyokusai, to shatter like a jewel in a final, hopeless suicide charge. This wasn't the honorable death promised in the Senjinkun. It was a waste of life. The psychological crack was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion of faith. Letters found on the bodies of fallen soldiers changed in tone. They no longer spoke only of the emperor's glory. They spoke of the green hell, of the smell of death, and of the bitter realization that they had been abandoned by their leaders. The myth that the Japanese spirit could overcome material lack was dying in the face of American steel and a complete lack of rice. By the time the Americans captured the Akutan Zero and began mass-producing the Hellcat to destroy it, the Japanese soldier on the ground had reached his own breaking point. The fear of surrender was still there, the fear of shame and the fear of torture by the Western barbarians. But for the first time, the alternative of living was starting to look more rational than the cult of death. The crack had formed, and through that crack, the first hints of a massive shift in surrender rates began to leak out. The warriors of the rising sun were realizing that their divine protection had vanished, leaving them alone in a world that had moved far beyond the limits of their ancient codes.
In the final years of the Pacific War, the most lethal weapon in the American arsenal wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was made of paper. For years, the Allies had struggled to capture Japanese soldiers who preferred suicide to the disgrace of surrender. But by 1944, a group of social scientists, linguists, and psychologists in the U.S. Office of War Information, WWII, realized they had been fighting the wrong war. To increase the surrender rate, they didn't need to break the Japanese soldier's body, they needed to reshape his mind. This was the era of the life-saving leaflets. Earlier in the war, American propaganda had been crude and insulting, often mocking the emperor. This only hardened Japanese resistance. However, the new strategy was surgical. These leaflets were designed to provide a bridge of honor across which a soldier could walk without losing his soul. They stopped using the word surrender, kofuku, which carried an unbearable weight of shame. Instead, they used the term gomen kudasai, meaning I cease resistance, or phrases that framed the act as coming over to the side of peace. One of the most effective leaflets was the life-saving ticket. It was printed with high-quality ink and designed to look like an official document. It didn't ask the soldier to betray his country. It invited him to save his life for the reconstruction of Japan. The text focused on the soldier's family, his mother waiting at home, his wife, his children. It reminded him that his death in a muddy hole would not save the empire, but his survival would be necessary to rebuild a new Japan from the ashes. The U.S. began bombing Japanese positions with millions of these slips of paper. In the caves of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and the Philippines, starving soldiers would wait for the sun to go down, then crawl out to retrieve these forbidden documents. Their officers threatened to execute anyone caught with a leaflet, but the psychological seed had been planted. For a soldier who hadn't eaten in weeks and was suffering from malaria, the leaflet wasn't just paper, it was a physical manifestation of a way out. The leaflets also addressed the primary fear holding them back, the rumor that Americans tortured and killed prisoners. The WWII included photos of Japanese POWs eating hot meals, smoking cigarettes, and receiving medical care from American doctors. These images were powerful because they contradicted everything the Japanese military had taught their men. The impact was measurable. Intelligence officers noticed that more and more Japanese soldiers were emerging from the jungle holding these leaflets above their heads. In some cases, soldiers would point to a specific paragraph in the leaflet as if to say, "I am here because you promised I could live." By focusing on the honorable peace rather than dishonorable capture, the U.S. successfully bypassed the Bushido Code. The life-saving leaflets proved that empathy and cultural understanding were more effective than brute force. They turned the tide from a 1% surrender rate toward a future where soldiers realized that their lives had value beyond the battlefield. It was a psychological masterstroke that saved thousands of lives, both American and Japanese, by replacing the cult of death with the hope of a homecoming. By April 1945, the Pacific War had reached the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Okinawa was not just another island invasion. It was the final, bloody gateway to Japan itself. For years, the world had watched Japanese soldiers choose mass suicide over surrender, maintaining a near-zero survival rate. But on the jagged ridges and in the limestone caves of Okinawa, something fundamental broke. This was the 15% shift, the moment the psychological dam finally burst. The statistics from Okinawa tell a story of a profound cultural transformation. Out of the roughly 77,000-man garrison of the Japanese 32nd Army, nearly 7,000 to 10,000 soldiers eventually surrendered or were captured alive. While the majority still fought to the death, the surrender rate jumped from a negligible 1% to a shocking 10 to 15%. This surge was a combination of physical desperation and a changing demographic within the Japanese ranks. Unlike the elite, highly indoctrinated professional soldiers of the war's early years, the defenders of Okinawa were often boyate, home guard units consisting of Okinawan conscripts, middle-aged men, and even high school students. These men had not spent their entire lives under the rigid discipline of the Imperial Army's death over dishonor cult. As they watched their commanders retreat into deep underground bunkers while leaving the rank and file to be incinerated by American flamethrower tanks, the logic of Bushido began to fail. The conditions on the island were hellish. Constant rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, and the relentless American artillery bombardment, known as the Typhoon of Steel, left no place to hide. Soldiers were trapped in caves for weeks, surrounded by the stench of death and the cries of the wounded. When the U.S. Marines and Army troops used loudspeakers to broadcast messages in Japanese, promising water, food, and safety, the primal instinct for survival finally outweighed the abstract fear of shame. In the final days of the battle, American soldiers witnessed scenes that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Groups of 10, 20, and even 50 Japanese soldiers would emerge from caves with their hands raised. Some even assisted the Americans by calling out to their comrades to come out and live. The 15% shift proved that the human spirit has a breaking point where even the most intense indoctrination cannot hold against total isolation and the promise of life. This shift was a harbinger of the end. It signaled to the American command that the Japanese soldier was not a robotic killing machine, but a human being who could be reached through psychological pressure and a demonstration of humanity. The 15% who lived through Okinawa would become part of the foundation of post-war Japan, proof that a nation could survive its own defeat. The shattered jewel was no longer the option. For the first time in the war, the Japanese soldier was choosing the difficult, honorable path of living to rebuild.
On August 15, 1945, the scorching summer heat over Japan was met with a chilling, unprecedented silence. Millions of people, soldiers in their trenches, families in their ravaged homes, and workers in their factories huddled around radio sets. They were waiting for a moment that had never occurred in thousands of years of Japanese history. For the first time, the jewel voice of the emperor was to be broadcast to his subjects. This was the emperor's voice, the final reckoning. The voice that emerged from the static was high-pitched, archaic, and formal. Emperor Hirohito spoke in the court language of the Gyokuon Hoso, a dialect so formal that many ordinary citizens struggled to understand the literal words. But the message was clear in its tone. Japan was to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. The war was over. The empire had surrendered. For the Japanese soldier, this broadcast was the ultimate psychological shock. For years, they had been told that surrender was a fate worse than death. They had been trapped in a cultural cycle where the only honorable end was to die for the emperor. Now, that very emperor was telling them to live. In a single broadcast, the 15% surrender rate of Okinawa was transformed into a 100% mandate for peace. The emperor's voice provided the permission to live that the military code had so brutally denied them. The reaction across the Pacific was a mixture of profound relief and shattering grief. In the remote jungles of the Philippines and the caves of the Bypass Islands, many soldiers initially believed the broadcast was an American trick. They had been so deeply indoctrinated in the cult of non-surrender that the idea of the emperor surrendering felt like the universe itself had collapsed. Some officers committed seppuku in front of their men, unable to reconcile the reality of defeat with their rigid code of honor. However, for the vast majority of the rank and file, the jewel voice was a lifeline. It allowed them to lay down their weapons not as cowards, but as loyal subjects obeying their sovereign's command. The shift was immediate. Across the Pacific, thousands of men who had been prepared to die in a final Banzai charge walked out of the shadows and toward American lines. They were skeletal, diseased, and exhausted. But they were no longer ghosts. They were men with a future. This was the final reckoning, the realization that the true Japanese spirit was not about a glorious death in the mud, but about the resilience to survive and rebuild. The 1% surrender rate of 1942 was a symptom of a nation lost in a martial trance. The mass surrender of 1945 was the awakening of a nation that chose to live. As the American occupation forces landed on the shores of Japan, they didn't find a population of suicide bombers. They found a people who, following the emperor's lead, turned their legendary discipline away from war and toward the monumental task of reconstruction. The voice from the radio
broke the cult of death, and in its place, it planted the seeds of the modern, peaceful Japan we know today. The War of the Eagles of the Pacific had ended not with a final explosion, but with a quiet, trembling voice on the radio, granting a generation the right to go home.